The snow blanketed the streets of a small southern town in the United States, a rare sight that added a magical touch to the morning after Christmas. Bright ribbons of garland hung across porch railings, and twinkling lights still glimmered from windows, whispering of the joy of the night before. Amid the serene scene, 8-year-old Amara's laughter echoed down the street as she rode her brand-new red bicycle. It had been a gift from her single mother, Lila, who had saved for months to afford it, praying every night that God would provide. Lila often told Amara that blessings came through faith and perseverance. "Remember, baby," she'd say, "every gift is a piece of God's grace." Amara believed this wholeheartedly. Her bicycle wasn't just a toy, it was a symbol of answered prayers. But joy can be fleeting in a world weighed down by prejudice. As Amara turned the corner of the quiet neighborhood, a group of white boys, no older than 12, spotted her. Their expressions darkened, and hushed murmurs turned into snickers. The leader of the group, a lanky boy with freckles and a mean streak, stepped in front of her path. "Nice bike," he sneered, the others laughing behind him. Amara's smile faltered, but her heart held steady. Lila had always taught her to keep her composure, even in the face of cruelty. "Thank you," she said softly, trying to steer around them. Before she could move, the freckled boy shoved her. The world blurred as she toppled to the ground, her cheek hitting the icy pavement. Her bicycle clattered beside her, a wheel still spinning. The boys jeered, their laughter cutting through the cold air. Amara lay still for a moment, the sting of humiliation burning more than the scrape on her face. She whispered under her breath, "Lord, please help me." Lila, watching from the window of their modest house, rushed out as the boys fled. She cradled Amara in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Are you hurt, baby?" "I'm okay, Mama," Amara replied. But her eyes were filled with something deeper, a yearning for justice, for understanding, for hope. In the quiet of that Christmas morning, as the snow fell gently around them, Lila knelt on the ground with her daughter and prayed aloud. "Lord, give us strength and show us the path to your justice." In the days following the incident, Lila noticed a quiet change in Amara. Her daughter's usual chatter had become subdued, her joy dulled. The red bicycle, once the source of boundless excitement, now sat untouched on the porch, its frame gleaming under the winter sun. Lila prayed constantly, asking God for guidance on how to heal Amara's spirit. One evening, as Lila prepared dinner, she turned to her daughter, who was sitting silently at the kitchen table, tracing shapes on the edge of her plate. "Baby, talk to me," Lila said gently. "What's on your mind?" Amara hesitated, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Mama, why do they hate me?" Her voice wavered, her brown eyes filled with confusion. "I didn't do anything to them." The question pierced Lila's heart. She knelt beside her daughter and held her close. "It's not about you, Amara," she said softly. "Sometimes people carry darkness in their hearts, and they don't see the light of God's love. But you can't let their darkness dim your light." Amara nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Lila decided that it wasn't enough to comfort her daughter with words. She needed to show her that faith could be a powerful force for change. That Sunday, Lila and Amara attended their small evangelical church, as they always did. The sanctuary was humble, with worn pews and a cross that gleamed from the sunlight streaming through a stained glass window. Pastor Thomas, a kind, middle-aged man with a deep, resonant voice, welcomed them with a warm smile. During the service, Lila stood and asked to speak to the congregation. Holding Amara's hand, she walked to the front of the church and faced the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "my daughter faced something no child should ever have to face. She was hurt, not just physically, but in her heart, by those who couldn't see her as God sees her." The congregation murmured in sympathy, heads nodding solemnly. "But we serve a mighty God," Lila continued, "and I believe he is calling us to respond, not with anger, but with love and action. Let's show this town what it means to live in God's grace and justice." After the service, members of the congregation approached Lila and Amara, offering words of encouragement and support. Sister Bernice, an elderly woman known for her wisdom, placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder. "Sweet child," she said, her eyes shining. "You're a light in this world. Don't let anyone dim it." That moment planted a seed of hope in Amara's heart. Lila, determined to build on that hope, decided to organize a community event that would bring people of all races together. She envisioned a celebration of unity and faith, something that could show the town the power of love over hate. The following week, Lila and Amara worked tirelessly to plan the event. They called it the Christmas of Light, a gathering that would include music, food, and a donation drive for families in need. With the help of the church and the local community, they spread the word, knocking on doors and hanging flyers in every shop window. Meanwhile, the boys who had pushed Amara off her bike began to hear about the event. Their leader, the freckled boy, overheard his mother talking about it at dinner. "It's a waste of time," he scoffed, poking at his food. But his mother looked at him sharply. "You do well to listen and learn something," she said. "The world isn't just about you, boy." The day of the event arrived, and the churchyard buzzed with activity. Tables were laden with steaming dishes of food, and the sound of gospel music filled the air. Amara, wearing her Sunday best, stood beside her mother, greeting visitors with a shy smile. People from all parts of the town came, drawn by curiosity and the promise of celebration. For many, it was their first time seeing neighbors they had only known from a distance. As the crowd grew, Lila stood on the makeshift stage and took the microphone. "Today is about coming together," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's about showing that God's love knows no boundaries. Hate divides, but love unites." The crowd erupted into applause. For the first time in days, Amara felt a spark of joy as she saw the smiles around her. But as the evening wore on, her eyes caught sight of the freckled boy standing at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but he stayed watching. As the evening unfolded, the Christmas of Light event grew livelier. Families mingled, children played, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and gospel hymns. The gathering seemed to melt away invisible walls that had separated the townsfolk for years. Lila moved gracefully through the crowd, offering warm smiles and quiet prayers for everyone she met. Amara, though still a bit shy, began to feel the glow of acceptance as neighbors greeted her kindly. Toward the edge of the event, the freckled boy remained, observing the scene with an uncertain expression. His name was Jimmy, and though he would never admit it, the days since the incident had been restless ones for him. His mother's disapproving words and the guilt gnawing at his conscience left him uneasy. Seeing Amara laughing softly with a group of children near the stage stirred something unfamiliar in him regret. When Pastor Thomas invited everyone to join in prayer under the twinkling string lights, Jimmy hesitated. The crowd formed a circle, hands linked in a gesture of unity. He stayed on the sidelines, unsure whether to join. But then, to his surprise, Amara's gaze met his. For a moment, her dark eyes held his, neither angry nor fearful, but filled with something deeper grace. Amara whispered something to her mother, who nodded. With a deep breath, the little girl stepped away from the group and walked toward Jimmy. Her small figure seemed to carry an immense strength as she approached him. "Hi," she said softly, her voice steady. Jimmy looked down at his shoes, his cheeks flushing. "Hi," he muttered. There was a pause before Amara continued. "You can join us if you want. Mama says the circle is for everyone." Jimmy's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't find the words to respond, so he simply nodded and followed her back to the group. When they reached the circle, Amara slipped her hand into his, her small fingers squeezing lightly. On his other side, Pastor Thomas extended his hand to Jimmy, a gentle smile on his face. "Let's pray together," the pastor said. As the prayer began, Jimmy felt an odd sensation, like a weight lifting off his chest. The pastor's words were filled with hope and healing, and for the first time, Jimmy felt the stirrings of a desire to make things right. After the prayer, Lila took the stage again to thank everyone for coming. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Together, we can build a community that reflects God's love and grace. And we'll start with something small but powerful, a community fund to help those in need." The crowd murmured in approval as Lila explained the plan. The fund would provide financial assistance for struggling families, support educational opportunities, and organize events that fostered unity. Several people, including local business owners, pledged donations on the spot. Amara watched her mother with pride. Lila's faith and determination inspired everyone around her, including her daughter. But as the night wound down, Amara couldn't help but notice Jimmy lingering nearby. He seemed hesitant, almost as if he were waiting for something. She walked over to him again, emboldened by her mother's example. "Jimmy," she began, "I forgive you." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Jimmy's eyes widened, and his lips trembled as he tried to speak. "I am sorry," he finally stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know why I did it." Amara nodded, her face serious. "Mama says we all make mistakes, but it's what we do after that matters." Jimmy looked down, kicking at a patch of snow. Do you think I could help with the fund? Maybe. Make it up to you?" A warm smile spread across Amara's face. "I think that's a good idea." Over the next few weeks, Jimmy became an unexpected ally in the community effort. At first, he kept a low profile, quietly helping with tasks like hanging flyers or organizing donations. But as time went on, he found himself drawn into the mission. He even offered to fix Amara's bicycle, replacing a bent spoke and polishing the frame until it gleamed like new. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Jimmy's mother, who had been deeply ashamed of his behavior, saw the change in her son and began attending church herself. Other parents, inspired by the community fund and its efforts, brought their children to join the activities. Slowly but surely, the town began to shift. Lila's community fund gained momentum, with generous contributions pouring in from unexpected places. A local philanthropist, moved by the story of the event, pledged a large donation to expand the initiative. "It's amazing what a little faith and determination can do," he said at a town meeting. Amara, meanwhile, grew more confident. Her bicycle became a symbol of resilience, and she rode it proudly through the streets again, this time greeted by smiles and waves from neighbors. Jimmy often joined her, their laughter echoing through the town as they raced along the snowy paths. The following months brought remarkable progress to the small town. The Christmas of Light initiative had blossomed into a series of community projects, tutoring programs, financial workshops, and neighborhood cleanups. The once divided town now buzzed with new energy. Amara and Jimmy, once symbols of division, became the unlikely faces of this transformation, their friendship an emblem of hope. But not everyone celebrated the change. Beneath the surface, resentment festered in a few corners of the town. For some, the growing unity challenged long-held prejudices and power dynamics. Among these dissenters was Mr. Grayson, a prominent businessman whose family had long controlled key aspects of the town's economy. Known for his stern demeanor and deeply ingrained biases, he viewed the newfound harmony as a threat to the status quo and his influence. One day, as Lila was returning home from a church meeting, she found an envelope wedged into her mailbox. The paper was coarse, and her name was scrawled hastily across the front. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a note written in bold, sharp letters. "Stay in your place. This town doesn't need your kind stirring things up." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the quiet street, her eyes scanning for anyone who might have been watching. But the snow-covered sidewalks were empty, and the houses seemed to slumber under their frosty roofs. Her hands trembled as she folded the note and slipped it into her purse. That night, after putting Amara to bed, Lila sat at the kitchen table, her Bible open in front of her. She ran her fingers over the worn pages, searching for strength in the Word. Her eyes landed on Isaiah 41:10. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The words calmed her heart, and she knelt in prayer. "Lord, give me courage," she whispered. "Help me face this with grace, not fear." The following day, Lila confided in Pastor Thomas. The pastor listened intently, his face grim as she showed him the note. "This is troubling, Lila," he said, his voice steady. "But remember, The enemy often strikes hardest when God's work is thriving. We'll handle this together. Pastor Thomas suggested a meeting with the town council to discuss the progress of the community projects. Let's show them the impact of this work, he said. Transparency will strengthen our cause and disarm those who wish to see it fail. Lila agreed, though she felt a twinge of unease. At the meeting, held in the town hall, she presented a detailed report of the initiatives funded by the community project. Charts and photographs highlighted the improved literacy rates among children, the number of families helped with financial aid, and the unity fostered through events like the Christmas of Light. The room was filled with murmurs of approval, but Mr. Grayson, seated at the back with his arms crossed, remained stone-faced. When Lila finished her presentation, he stood and cleared his throat. "It's all very noble," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But how do we know this isn't just charity for show? What happens when the money runs out? When people go back to their old ways?" The room fell silent. Lila straightened her back, meeting his gaze. "This isn't just about charity, Mr. Grayson," she said calmly. "It's about changing hearts and minds, about giving people the tools to build better lives not just for themselves, but for everyone in this town." Her words sparked applause, but Grayson's expression darkened. He left the meeting abruptly, his heavy boots echoing down the hall. That evening, as Amara rode her bicycle through the neighborhood, she noticed a figure standing near the edge of the park where she and Jimmy often played. It was a man tall, with a gray coat and a fedora pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off, and Amara's instincts told her to ride home quickly. When she arrived, she found Lila sitting on the porch, lost in thought. "Mama," Amara said, catching her breath. There was a man by the park. He looked strange. Lila's face tightened, but she forced a smile. "It's probably nothing, baby," she said, pulling Amara close. "You stay near home for now, okay?" The next morning, the quiet town woke to an unsettling sight. Someone had vandalized the church, spray painting hateful words across its front doors. The congregation gathered in disbelief, their faces pale with shock. Pastor Thomas stood before the defaced doors, his jaw clenched. "This is an attack on all of us," he said, "but we will not respond with hate. We'll respond with faith." As the crowd murmured their agreement, Jimmy stepped forward. "I'll help clean it up," he said firmly. Amara joined him, her small hands reaching for a bucket of soapy water. One by one, others came forward, until the entire congregation worked together to erase the hateful message. But as they worked, Lila felt a chill creep down her spine. The note in her mailbox, the man by the park, the vandalism, these weren't isolated incidents. Someone was determined to stop their progress, and whoever it was wouldn't back down easily. The days following the church vandalism were tense. The congregation, usually filled with the warmth of fellowship, now spoke in hushed tones about who might be behind the attacks. Lila, though deeply troubled, refused to let fear take root in her heart. Every evening, she gathered Amara and knelt beside her bed in prayer. "We're not alone in this, baby," she would whisper. "God is with us." But Lila also knew that faith had to be paired with action. After consulting with Pastor Thomas, she decided to address the congregation during the next Sunday service. The church was packed that morning, the pews filled with anxious faces. Lila stood before them, her hands clasped tightly together. "I know many of you are afraid," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "And I know that fear can make us question our path. But this," she gestured toward the freshly cleaned church doors, "is not a sign for us to retreat. It's a sign that we're making a difference. The enemy doesn't attack what isn't a threat." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Lila continued, her voice rising with conviction. "We will not let hatred dictate our future. This town is changing, and we are part of that change. But we must be vigilant. We must support one another and trust that God will guide us through this storm." As the service ended, people lingered to offer words of encouragement. Sister Bernice, always a pillar of strength, hugged Lila tightly. "You're doing God's work, child," she said. "Don't let them scare you." That evening, while Lila was preparing dinner, there was a knock at the door. She opened it cautiously to find Jimmy standing on the porch, his hands gripping the handlebars of Amara's bike. The boy had made some improvements. The chain was newly oiled, and he'd attached a small basket to the front. "I finished fixing it," he said shyly, avoiding Lila's eyes. "I thought Amara might like it." Lila smiled warmly, her heart softening at the sight of the boy's effort. "Thank you, Jimmy." "That's very kind of you." Jimmy hesitated before speaking again. "Mrs. Lila, I think I might know who's behind what happened at the church." Lila's breath caught. "Who, Jimmy?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I heard Mr. Grayson talking to my dad the other day. He said the church and the fund are stirring up trouble." He didn't say it outright, but "I think he's the one." Lila nodded slowly, her mind racing. Mr. Grayson's disdain for the community efforts was no secret, but this was the first real lead. "Thank you for telling me, Jimmy," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're brave to come forward." Lila shared Jimmy's revelation with Pastor Thomas and a small group of trusted church members. They debated how to proceed. Some wanted to confront Mr. Grayson directly, while others, including Pastor Thomas, urged caution. "We don't have solid proof," he said, his tone measured, "and if we act rashly, we could make things worse. Let's pray for wisdom and see if the Lord reveals a path forward." But Mr. Grayson wasn't done making his moves. The next day, an article appeared in the local newspaper, written by an anonymous contributor. It criticized the church's fund, claiming it was mismanaged and a breeding ground for division. The piece cast doubt on Lila's leadership, suggesting she was using the fund for personal gain. Lila was stunned when she saw the article. Sitting at the kitchen table, she felt the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. Amara, sensing her mother's distress, climbed into her lap and wrapped her arms around her. "Mama," she said softly, "don't let them win. You always say God is bigger than the bad stuff." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she hugged her daughter tightly. "You're right, baby," she said. "We'll get through this." At the next town meeting, Lila addressed the accusations head-on. Standing in front of a packed room, she held her head high. "I'm here to tell you the truth," she began. "Every dollar in that fund has been accounted for, and every project has been done with the community's best interests at heart." She presented detailed financial records, meticulously prepared by volunteers who supported her. As she spoke, members of the church and community stood behind her, a visible sign of solidarity. Even Jimmy's father, who had been skeptical of the church's efforts, stood among them, his arms crossed but his expression resolute. In the crowd, Mr. Grayson watched silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. Lila's words were met with applause, but she knew the battle was far from over. After the meeting, she overheard Mr. Grayson muttering to a colleague. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." That night, Lila gathered her closest supporters at the church. They discussed ways to protect the fund and the community's progress. Pastor Thomas suggested reaching out to a larger organization for support, one with the resources to help them withstand any legal or financial attacks. "We need to think bigger," he said. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about setting an example for other towns like ours." The group agreed, and plans were set in motion to connect with regional evangelical networks. Lila's determination only grew stronger. "If they want to fight," she said quietly, "we'll fight. But we'll do it God's way with truth, faith, and love." As Lila and her supporters worked tirelessly to protect the fund and their mission, the pressure on the community continued to mount. The accusations against the church stirred skepticism among a few townsfolk, particularly those who had already harbored quiet doubts about the movement's inclusivity. Some began to withdraw their support, choosing to stay silent rather than risk being caught in the conflict. Among the few who stayed steadfast was Sister Bernice. One evening, after a long day of organizing the next community event, she sat with Lila in the dimly lit church office. "You know, child," she began, her voice tinged with both wisdom and weariness, "the devil doesn't fight fair. He comes for you when you're making progress. But that's when you dig in deeper. The people who believe in this work, they need to see your strength now more than ever." Lila nodded, her resolve firm. "We won't give up, Sister Bernice. God brought us this far, and he'll see us through." As part of their new strategy, Lila reached out to a regional evangelical network that supported faith-based community projects. The organization, known as Faith Forward, had helped churches across the country combat similar challenges. After several calls and emails, Faith Forward agreed to send a representative to the town, a woman named Angela Porter, whose background as a civil rights attorney and devout Christian made her uniquely suited to guide them. When Angela arrived, she brought with her a wealth of knowledge and a calm, commanding presence. "You're doing important work here," she told Lila during their first meeting. "But you're not fighting just one battle. You're fighting decades of ingrained division and power structures. That's not something that changes overnight." Angela suggested a two-pronged approach, strengthening the legal protections for the fund while also building alliances beyond the church. "If this community sees that your work isn't just for one group, but for everyone, it'll be harder for detractors to undermine it." To that end, Angela helped organize a town-wide outreach campaign. Flyers were distributed not only to churchgoers, but also to schools, businesses, and even the local library. The campaign emphasized unity and showcased the tangible benefits of the community fund, from tutoring programs to emergency financial assistance. While this broader outreach brought new allies, it also attracted more hostility. Late one evening, as Lila and Angela worked in the church office, the phone rang. Angela answered, her professional tone quickly giving way to concern. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line went dead. "What did they say?" Lila asked, her chest tightening. Angela hesitated before answering. "They said you should stop meddling where you don't belong." "It's an empty threat, Lila, but we should still be cautious." The following morning, Lila noticed fresh graffiti on the church's side wall. This time, the message was personal. "Go back where you came from." Amara saw it too and clung to her mother's side, her small frame trembling. Lila knelt down and held her daughter close. "Listen to me, baby," she said firmly. "Words like that don't have power over us. God made us, and we belong wherever He places us." Despite Lila's brave front, the vandalism unsettled her. She called a meeting with her core team, including Angela, Pastor Thomas, and Sister Bernice. They decided to install security cameras around the church and seek help from local authorities. Meanwhile, Amara faced her own challenges. At school, whispers followed her in the hallways. A few classmates, egged on by their parents' prejudices, teased her about her mother's efforts. "Your mama thinks she can fix everything," one boy sneered during recess. But some things don't change. Amara clenched her fists, but remembered her mother's words. "You can't fight darkness with darkness." Instead, she took a deep breath and replied, "Maybe some things can change if people are brave enough to try." Jimmy, who had been quietly standing nearby, stepped forward. "Leave her alone," he said sharply. The boy backed off, grumbling under his breath. Jimmy turned to Amara. "You okay?" She nodded, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Jimmy." The tension in town reached a boiling point during the next community event. Held in the park, the gathering was meant to celebrate the success of the tutoring program and encourage more families to participate. Lila stood on the small stage, addressing the crowd, when a commotion erupted near the back. Mr. Grayson had arrived, flanked by a small group of supporters. He approached the stage, his voice booming. "This whole thing is a sham," he shouted, pointing at Lila. "She's just trying to divide this town with her so-called unity projects." The crowd murmured in confusion, some people stepping back while others moved closer, determined to protect Lila. Angela, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "Mr. Grayson, if you have concerns, we're happy to address them, but shouting baseless accusations isn't the way." Grayson scoffed. "You think some outsider can come in here and tell us how to run our town? This is our home, not yours." Lila took the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "This town belongs to all of us, Mr. Grayson, and we're not here to divide, we're here to heal. If you want to talk, we'll listen, but we won't be silenced." The crowd erupted into applause, drowning out Grayson's retort. As he stormed off, Angela leaned toward Lila. "He's losing control," she said. That's why he's getting louder. That night, as Lila and Amara walked home from the event, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that things were coming to a head. The opposition was growing more desperate, and the stakes felt higher than ever. But as they passed under the glow of a street lamp, Amara slipped her hand into her mother's. "You're doing the right thing, Mama," she said. "I know it." Lila smiled, the warmth of her daughter's faith bolstering her own. "We are, baby," she replied. "And with God's help, we'll keep going." As the days stretched into weeks, the tension in the town remained palpable. Despite Lila's unwavering faith and the growing support for her efforts, the emotional toll began to weigh heavily on her. Nights were restless, with worry creeping into her prayers. Was she truly strong enough to lead this battle? Was her faith enough to withstand the mounting pressure? One evening, after putting Amara to bed, Lila found herself alone in the living room, staring at the Bible resting on the coffee table. Her hands trembled as she flipped through its pages, searching for answers, for comfort. The weight of the community's expectations felt unbearable, and doubt began to whisper in her heart. Angela found her the next morning at the church, sitting in the front pew with her head bowed. "Rough night?" Angela asked, sliding into the seat beside her. Lila nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to stay strong, but what if I fail? What if I let everyone down?" Angela placed a comforting hand on Lila's shoulder. "Lila, you've already accomplished so much. People see God's light through you, but it's okay to feel tired. Even Jesus retreated to pray when the burden grew heavy. Lean on those who want to help you. You don't have to carry this alone." Her words brought tears to Lila's eyes. She realized that in her effort to shield Amara and the community, she had forgotten to lean on her own faith community for strength. She nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "I can't let my pride keep me from accepting help." Meanwhile, Amara struggled with her own emotional battles. Though her resilience had grown, the teasing at school persisted. One day, as she sat in the cafeteria, a group of kids snickered nearby, whispering cruel remarks. Amara looked down at her tray, her appetite fading. But then she heard a familiar voice. "Why don't you leave her alone?" Jimmy had stepped between Amara and the group, his eyes blazing with anger. The leader of the group sneered. "What's it to you, Jimmy? You're just trying to look good because you are one of the bad guys." The words struck a nerve, and Jimmy's fists clenched. But instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath. "Yeah, I messed up," he said. "But at least I'm trying to make things right. What are you doing?" The cafeteria fell silent, the group stunned by Jimmy's boldness. The bullies slinked away, leaving Amara and Jimmy alone. Amara looked up at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jimmy shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's what friends do." That evening, as Lila and Amara sat together on the couch, Amara told her mother about what had happened at school. "Jimmy stood up for me," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "He's not the same as he was before." Lila smiled, pulling her daughter close. "That's the power of grace, baby. It changes people when they let it." Amara hesitated, then asked, "Mama, do you think Mr. Grayson could change too?" The question caught Lila off guard. Could someone like Grayson, who seemed so entrenched in his hatred, truly transform? Lila sighed, brushing a strand of hair from Amara's face. "With God, anything is possible," she said, "but it takes a willing heart. All we can do is pray for him and keep doing what's right." The following Sunday, Pastor Thomas delivered a sermon on forgiveness. Standing at the pulpit, he spoke with passion and conviction. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending the wrong never happened. It means freeing yourself from the chains of anger and bitterness. It means trusting that God's justice will prevail, even when the world feels unjust." Lila listened intently, the words resonating deeply within her. She thought about Mr. Grayson and the hatred he carried. Could she forgive him, even as he continued to attack her work? The thought challenged her, forcing her to confront the limits of her faith. After the service, Lila stayed behind, sitting in silent contemplation. Amara joined her, sliding onto the pew beside her. "Mama," she said, "I think you should talk to him, Talk to who, baby? Lila asked. Mr. Grayson, Amara said. Maybe he just needs to hear the truth from someone who cares. Lila's instinct was to dismiss the idea, but something about Amara's earnestness made her pause. Could it be that God was calling her to take this step? With Angela's encouragement, Lila decided to reach out to Mr. Grayson. She approached his office one afternoon, her heart pounding. When his secretary ushered her into the room, he looked up from his desk, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. Lila took a deep breath. "I want to talk," she said. "Not to argue or fight, but to understand." Grayson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Understand what? That you're turning this town upside down with your so-called unity projects?" Lila met his gaze calmly. "I want to understand why you see it that way. And I want to tell you why I'm doing this, not to divide, but to bring people together." The conversation was tense and fraught with unspoken hostility, but as Lila spoke, sharing her faith and her vision for the town, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Grayson's face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lila left Mr. Grayson's office with a swirl of emotions. The conversation had been civil, but his resistance to change was palpable. While he hadn't outright dismissed her, his parting words stuck in her mind. "This town isn't ready for what you're trying to do, Lila. You're stirring waters that have been still for a reason." She replayed the conversation later that evening as she prepared dinner. Amara sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of a snowy church scene, humming softly. Lila forced herself to smile as she set a plate in front of her daughter. "How's the masterpiece coming along?" she asked. Amara looked up, grinning. "Almost done, Mama. Do you think I could show it at church?" Lila nodded. "Of course, baby. It'll be perfect for the Christmas service." But her thoughts wandered back to Mr. Grayson. His words hadn't shaken her faith, but they left her uneasy. If he wasn't willing to change, what else might he do to stop their progress? The next morning, Angela stopped by the church office with surprising news. "I've been looking into Mr. Grayson's dealings," she said, setting a stack of papers on Lila's desk. "There's something you need to see." Lila leaned forward, scanning the documents. They detailed land ownership records, contracts, and town council meeting notes, all pointing to a startling revelation. Mr. Grayson owned several properties in the town's most impoverished neighborhoods, including land that had been donated to the community fund for future projects. "He's been quietly buying up property for years," Angela explained, "and now that the fund is using some of that land for development, he's losing his grip. That's why he's been so hostile." Lila's heart sank. "He doesn't just oppose the fund because of prejudice, he's protecting his financial interests." Angela nodded grimly. "Exactly. And if he's desperate enough, there's no telling what he might do." As the tension around the fund grew, so did the community's resolve. At the next church meeting, Lila shared the new information with her core team. Pastor Thomas was visibly troubled, but encouraged the group to stay focused. "This isn't just a battle of property or politics," he said. "It's a battle for the soul of this town. We have to keep moving forward with faith and integrity." The church decided to hold a town hall meeting to address the growing unrest and reveal the truth about Mr. Grayson's intentions. Flyers were distributed, and word spread quickly. The event was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center, and anticipation buzzed through the town. As Saturday approached, strange occurrences began to escalate. Angela noticed her car tires had been slashed when she left the church one evening. Lila found another note tucked under her front door. This one reading, "Stop now, or else." Though she tried to stay calm, Amara noticed her mother's unease. "Mama, are we in danger?" Amara asked one night as they prayed together. Lila hesitated but held her daughter's hands tightly. "We're safe, baby. God is watching over us. But sometimes doing what's right can make people angry. That's why we have to be brave." Amara nodded, her small face set with determination. "I'll be brave, Mama." Just like you, the night of the town hall arrived, and the community center was packed. Lila stood at the front of the room, Angela and Pastor Thomas by her side. The atmosphere was tense, with many attendees unsure of what to expect. Mr. Grayson sat near the back, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Angela began by presenting the financial records and land ownership documents. "This isn't just about race or tradition," she said. "It's about power. Mr. Grayson has been quietly profiting from the very people this fund is trying to help." Gasps rippled through the room as Angela laid out the evidence. Mr. Grayson stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted. "You think you can come into my town and tell me how to run things?" Lila stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't your town, Mr. Grayson. It's ours, all of ours, and we're tired of being divided. The community fund isn't about taking power from anyone, it's about giving power to everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, drowning out Grayson's protests. For the first time, Lila saw a crack in his defiance. He stormed out of the room, but his departure felt less like a triumph and more like a warning. After the town hall, Lila, Angela, and Pastor Thomas met to discuss next steps. "Grayson won't go quietly," Angela warned. "We need to be prepared for legal challenges or worse." Lila nodded, her resolve unwavering. "We'll face whatever comes. God's brought us this far, and he won't abandon us now." As they left the community center, Lila noticed Amara standing outside with Jimmy. The two were looking up at the stars, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp night air. Seeing them together gave Lila a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for the present, it was for the future, for children like Amara and Jimmy, who deserved to grow up in a world of hope and opportunity. But later that night, an ominous event shook the town. The church bell, which hadn't rung since the start of the fund's efforts, tolled loudly in the middle of the night. Lila rushed to the church, finding the bell tower vandalized and the bell itself marked with crude graffiti. Someone had left a chilling message on the church steps. "This is just the beginning." The incident solidified the seriousness of the opposition they faced. The battle was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The tolling of the vandalized church bell reverberated in the hearts of the townspeople, sending shockwaves through the community. For Lila, it was a stark reminder of the stakes they faced. The fight for justice and unity had grown beyond a local issue. It was now a battle between faith-driven hope and the fear-fueled forces resisting change. The next morning, Pastor Thomas called an emergency meeting at the church. The congregation gathered in tense silence, their faces etched with worry. Lila stood beside him at the pulpit, feeling the weight of their collective fear. "We know who our enemy is," Pastor Thomas said, his voice firm, yet compassionate. "But we also know who our protector is. This isn't the time to give into fear. It's the time to lean on God's strength and each other." Lila stepped forward, holding up the note left on the church steps. "This was meant to scare us," she said. "But let me remind you of something. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Her voice wavered with emotion, but the crowd responded with murmurs of agreement and resolve. As the church rallied together, Angela and Lila worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. Angela enlisted the help of a larger legal network tied to Faith Forward, filing complaints with local law enforcement and the state's Attorney General's office about the threats and vandalism. The network also brought in security experts who installed additional cameras around the church and community center. Meanwhile, Lila turned her focus back to the people. She began organizing home visits, sitting down with families who had grown distant or skeptical of the fund's efforts. She listened to their concerns, prayed with them, and shared stories of how the fund was already changing lives. Slowly, she began to rebuild trust with those who had been hesitant to join the movement. During one of these visits, Lila knocked on the door of Mrs. Conway, a widowed teacher who had lived in the town for decades. Mrs. Conway opened the door, her sharp blue eyes narrowing at Lila. "You've got nerve coming here," she said curtly. "I know some people have doubts about what we're doing," Lila said gently. "I just want to talk. Hear your side." Mrs. Conway hesitated before stepping aside. "You've got 5 minutes." Inside, the house was modest but warm, filled with books and photographs. As they talked, Lila learned that Mrs. Conway's late husband had been close friends with Mr. Grayson's father. "I've known that family for years," Mrs. Conway said. "They've done a lot for this town. But I'll admit, they've also done a lot to keep certain people in their place." Lila nodded. "Do you think it has to stay that way?" Mrs. Conway's lips pressed into a thin line. "No," she said finally. "It's long past time for things to change. But don't fool yourself, change like this comes at a cost. Are you ready to pay it?" Lila met her gaze steadily. "With God's help, I am." Meanwhile, Amara and Jimmy grew closer as they navigated the challenges at school. Jimmy, once an outsider in his own way, had become Amara's fiercest defender. The two often stayed late after school, working on assignments for the tutoring program funded by the church initiative. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Jimmy confided something that had been weighing on his heart. "I'm scared sometimes," he admitted, "that people won't ever really change. That I'll always be the kid who messed up." Amara stopped and looked at him with surprising maturity for her age. "My mama says people don't stay the same if they're brave enough to let God change them." "You're already brave, Jimmy. You just have to keep going." Her words struck Jimmy deeply, and for the first time, he felt a sense of hope that his past didn't have to define him. The town's tensions reached another boiling point when Mr. Grayson filed a lawsuit to block one of the fund's major projects, a community garden planned for a vacant lot that Grayson secretly owned. His argument was thin, claiming the project violated zoning laws, but it was enough to stall progress and fuel rumors that the fund wasn't as organized as it claimed. Angela, ever the strategist, saw the lawsuit as an opportunity. "We can turn this around," she told Lila during a late-night meeting. "Let's use this as a chance to highlight the good this project will bring. If we win this case, it'll show the town just how far Grayson is willing to go to keep things the way they are." The next Sunday, Lila addressed the congregation, explaining the situation and rallying their support. "This garden isn't just about planting vegetables," she said. "It's about planting hope, about showing this town that we can create something beautiful together." Her words reignited the community's spirit, and volunteers began organizing rallies and writing letters to local officials in support of the garden. Families who had never been involved before began showing up to help, spurred on by the vision of what the garden could become. But behind the scenes, Grayson's desperation grew. Late one night, he met with a small group of his supporters in his sprawling home on the edge of town. "They're getting too strong," he said, pacing angrily. "If we don't stop this now, they'll take over everything." One of the men, a local contractor with ties to Grayson's businesses, suggested something more drastic. "You need to show them who's in charge. Hit them where it hurts." Grayson hesitated, his jaw clenched. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go, but the pressure from his dwindling allies was mounting. The storm was brewing, and both sides prepared for the battles ahead. For Lila, the path forward was clear. Stand firm in faith, lean on her community, and trust that God would guide them through. But she knew the challenges would only grow harder, and the cost of their fight would demand even more courage, sacrifice, and grace. As the lawsuit over the community garden gained traction, the town's divisions became even more pronounced. Some residents, stirred by Mr. Grayson's claims, began questioning the integrity of the fund and the church's leadership. Others, inspired by Lila's vision, redoubled their efforts to support the project. The tension simmered, threatening to spill over. Lila remained steadfast, her faith anchoring her through the storm. She spent long hours preparing for the upcoming court hearing, working closely with Angela and her team to gather evidence and testimonies. Every detail mattered: the history of the land, the garden's potential benefits, and the widespread community support. But Lila wasn't just fighting in the courtroom. She continued her grassroots efforts, organizing workshops at the church and hosting open forums to address the community's concerns. One evening, after a particularly heated forum, Lila stayed behind to pray in the sanctuary. The flickering candles cast soft light on the cross above the altar as she knelt, her heart heavy with worry. "Lord, I know you've called me to this work," she whispered, "but I need your strength. Help me to be a light in the darkness, even when it feels overwhelming." The next day, as Lila walked Amara to school, she noticed a group of workers unloading supplies near the disputed lot. Grayson had hired a crew to fence off the property, a clear move to block any progress on the garden. The sight made Lila's stomach churn, but Amara squeezed her hand. "Mama, don't worry," Amara said. "You always say the truth wins in the end." Lila smiled, though the worry lingered in her eyes. "You're right, baby. We just have to keep trusting." At school, Amara faced a new challenge. The tension in the town had filtered into the classroom, and some of her peers, parroting their parents' opinions, began to isolate her. During lunch, she sat alone, quietly eating her sandwich, until Jimmy approached with his tray. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. Amara smiled and nodded, grateful for his friendship. But their peace didn't last long. A boy from the next table leaned over and sneered. "Still trying to save the world, huh, Jimmy? Hanging out with her isn't going to make you a hero." Jimmy stood, his face red with anger. "You're just mad because we're doing something that matters." He shot back. "What are you doing besides sitting here running your mouth?" The boy rolled his eyes, but Jimmy's words silenced. Amara felt a surge of pride. "Thank you," she said quietly, as Jimmy sat back down. "You don't have to thank me," Jimmy replied. "We're in this together." As tensions escalated, Lila began noticing more unsettling signs of resistance. One evening, as she returned home from a meeting, she found her porch light smashed. Another time, she caught a man loitering near the church, his face obscured by a hood. When she approached, he muttered something unintelligible and disappeared into the shadows. Angela, ever pragmatic, urged Lila to report every incident to the authorities. "We need a record of everything," she said. "The more evidence we have, the harder it'll be for them to deny what's happening." Lila agreed, but couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She doubled down on security, ensuring that the church and her home were as protected as possible. The pivotal moment came during a town council meeting, where both sides presented their arguments about the community garden. The room was packed, with residents spilling into the hallways. Grayson's lawyer argued that the land was private property and that the project violated zoning laws. Lila, calm but resolute, countered with the community's overwhelming support and evidence of the garden's potential benefit. Angela delivered the closing remarks, her words sharp and unwavering. "This isn't just a fight over land, it's a fight for the soul of this town. Are we going to let fear and greed dictate our future, or are we going to choose hope and unity?" The room erupted in applause, but Grayson remained stoic, his jaw clenched. As the council deliberated, the tension in the room was palpable. Hours later, the decision was announced. The council voted in favor of the community garden, declaring it a project that served the greater good. Cheers erupted, and tears welled in Lila's eyes as she hugged Angela and Pastor Thomas. Amara, who had been sitting in the audience with Jimmy, ran to her mother, beaming with pride. "You did it, Mama," she exclaimed. Lila knelt to embrace her daughter. "No, baby, we did it. All of us," but the victory was short-lived. That night, a fire broke out at the lot designated for the garden. By the time firefighters arrived, the area was engulfed in flames. The smell of smoke lingered in the air as Lila and Pastor Thomas stood by, watching the charred remains of their dream. Angela arrived soon after, her face grim. "This isn't just an accident," she said. "Someone is sending a message." Lila's heart ached as she looked at the devastation. But amidst the ashes, she found a renewed sense of purpose. "They think they can stop us with this," she said, her voice steady. "But they don't know how strong we are. We'll rebuild, we'll plant again, and we'll show them that love and faith are stronger than hate." The fire galvanized the community. People who had been hesitant before now stepped forward, offering their time, resources, and prayers to rebuild the garden. Even some of Grayson's allies began to distance themselves, uneasy with how far things had gone. Grayson, however, doubled down. In a private meeting with his remaining supporters, he vowed to find a way to shut down the fund entirely. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not by a long shot." The fire at the garden lot marked a turning point for the town. The devastation could have shattered the community's resolve, but instead, it became a rallying cry. Volunteers gathered in droves to clear the charred remains and begin anew. Despite their determination, the event deepened the divide between those supporting the fund and those backing Mr. Grayson's efforts to maintain control. For Lila, the fire was a test of her faith like no other. Each morning, she knelt by her bedside and prayed for guidance. The lingering smell of smoke in the air and the weight of the escalating threats reminded her that this battle wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Lord, she prayed one morning, her voice soft but steady, use me as your vessel. Show me how to fight this fight with grace, courage, and love. Meanwhile, Angela delved deeper into Mr. Grayson's dealings, working tirelessly to uncover evidence that could expose his involvement in the threats and sabotage. Late one evening, she called Lila to share a breakthrough. I found something, Angela said, her voice urgent. Grayson's been using shell companies to buy properties under the radar, and there's a paper trail linking him to the crew that fenced off the lot and to the contractor who built that fence right before the fire. Lila's heart raced. You think he's behind the fire? I can't prove that yet, Angela admitted, but this is enough to show a pattern of obstruction and manipulation. If we can bring this to light, it could change everything. They agreed to present the evidence at an upcoming town council meeting, one that promised to be the most contentious yet. As the meeting approached, tensions flared throughout the town. Grayson's supporters grew more vocal, spreading rumors about the church and the fund. At the same time, Lila's allies worked tirelessly to counteract the negativity, organizing rallies and distributing flyers highlighting the fund's successes. One night, as Lila prepared dinner, a rock shattered her living room window. She rushed to the front door and saw a figure disappearing into the darkness. Amara, frightened by the sound, clung to her mother. Mama, what if they heard us? She asked, her voice trembling. Lila knelt and held her daughter tightly. We're not alone, baby. God is with us. And there are so many people in this town who believe in what we're doing. We'll be okay. The night of the town council meeting arrived, and the air crackled with tension. The room was packed to capacity, with residents spilling into the hallways. Lila sat with Angela, Pastor Thomas, and a group of supporters, while Mr. Grayson and his allies occupied the opposite side of the room. Angela took the floor first, presenting the evidence of Grayson's covert property purchases and his connections to the contractor involved in fencing off the lot. Her presentation was methodical and damning, complete with documents, photographs, and testimony from witnesses. This is a clear attempt to undermine the community fund and the people it serves, Angela concluded. Mr. Grayson's actions aren't just unethical, they're harmful to the very fabric of this town. Grayson stood, his face red with anger. This is nothing but a smear campaign, he shouted. You people think you can come into my town and destroy everything my family built? I've done more for this town than anyone in this room. The council members looked uneasy, their eyes darting between Angela and Grayson. Finally, Lila rose to speak. This isn't about destroying anything, Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice calm but firm. It's about building something new, something better. This town doesn't belong to one person or one family. It belongs to all of us. And it's time we started acting like it. Her words were met with applause, but the atmosphere remained tense. The council announced that they would deliberate in private and reconvene the following week to announce their decision regarding the community fund and its future projects. As Lila and her supporters left the meeting, Grayson intercepted her outside. His face was a mask of controlled fury. You think you've won, don't you? He said, his voice low and menacing. But this isn't over. You don't know who you're dealing with. Lila stood her ground, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. No, Mr. Grayson, she said. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm not fighting alone. I have God on my side. And that's more than enough. Grayson scoffed and walked away, but Lila felt a strange sense of peace. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. That night, as Lila knelt in prayer, a knock sounded at her door. It was Sister Bernice, holding a bundle of letters. These just came in, she said, her eyes shining with hope. testimonies from families all over the town. "People are standing with you, child." Lila opened one of the letters and read aloud. "Because of the tutoring program, my son is reading at grade level for the first time. Thank you for believing in our children." Tears streamed down Lila's face as she read the heartfelt words. Each letter was a reminder of why she had started this journey and why she couldn't give up. The week leading up to the council's decision was fraught with both hope and anxiety. Grayson's allies launched a smear campaign, but it was met with an outpouring of support for the fund. People who had once been silent now spoke up, their voices joining a chorus calling for change. At the final council meeting, the tension was palpable. The room was silent as the council president announced their decision. The community fund would continue, and the garden project would proceed under additional legal protections to prevent further interference. The room erupted in cheers, but Grayson's glare cut through the celebration. Lila knew this wasn't the end, but it was a victory, and it set the stage for the final confrontation that would determine the future of the town. The decision to support the community fund and allow the garden project to proceed was a resounding victory, but it also intensified the opposition. For Mr. Grayson, it was a public humiliation. Behind closed doors, he vowed to escalate his efforts, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with renewed energy as volunteers rallied to restart the garden. Lila and her team wasted no time, organizing work days and securing additional donations for supplies. Even families who had previously remained neutral began showing up to help, inspired by the fund's resilience and the council's decision. Amara and Jimmy worked alongside the adults, their laughter punctuating the steady hum of progress. Amara's spirit, once shaken by the bullying at school, now shone brightly as she planted seeds in the freshly tilled soil. "We're making something beautiful, Jimmy," she said, her hands coated in dirt. "Mama says that's what God wants us to do." Jimmy smiled, his confidence growing with every passing day. "Your mama's right," but not everyone was celebrating. Late one night, as the garden took shape, a loud crash startled Lila from her sleep. She ran to the window and saw flames licking the edges of the church's front doors. The unmistakable glow of a firebomb lit up the night. Heart pounding, Lila grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, firefighters arrived, dousing the flames before they could spread further. The church was damaged but not destroyed. Pastor Thomas arrived shortly after, his face pale but determined. "This is an attack on all of us," he said, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "But they can't destroy what's in our hearts. We'll rebuild." The next morning, the town woke to the news of the attack. The church steps, once a place of prayer and hope, now bore the charred scars of hatred. But instead of retreating in fear, the community rallied once more. Donations poured in to repair the damage, and a vigil was organized to stand against the growing tide of violence. The vigil, held that evening in front of the church, drew a crowd larger than anyone had expected. People of all races and backgrounds gathered, holding candles and singing hymns. Lila stood at the center, flanked by Angela and Pastor Thomas. As the songs faded, Lila addressed the crowd. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "This fire wasn't just meant to destroy a building, it was meant to destroy our spirit. But they've failed. We are still here, and we will keep fighting for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause, their unity palpable. Among them, Amara and Jimmy held their candles high, their faces glowing with determination. That night, Angela called Lila with urgent news. "We've uncovered more evidence," she said. "One of the contractors linked to Grayson has confessed to setting the fire at the garden lot. He says Grayson paid him off." Lila's breath caught. "Does this mean we can take legal action?" "It's enough to open a criminal investigation," Angela replied, "but we'll need to move quickly. Grayson's connections run deep, and he'll do everything he can to cover his tracks." The revelation set off a whirlwind of activity. Angela worked with law enforcement to build a case, while Lila and Pastor Thomas rallied the community to stay vigilant. The news of Grayson's possible involvement spread rapidly, shifting public opinion even further against him. As the investigation gained momentum, Grayson became increasingly desperate. One evening, as Lila left the church after a late meeting, she found him waiting by her car. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow. "This needs to stop," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Lila stood her ground, her heart pounding, but her faith steady. "It's not me you need to worry about, Mr. Grayson. It's the truth." Grayson's lips tightened. "You think you've won, but you're wrong. People like me, we don't lose. You've already lost," Lila replied, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Because you're fighting against something bigger than yourself. You're fighting against justice, against hope, against God's will." Grayson's face hardened, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, the police arrested Grayson's contractor, and the investigation into the fire at the church intensified. Pressure mounted on Grayson as his allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk being implicated. Even some of his staunchest supporters publicly condemned his actions, leaving him increasingly isolated. The final blow came when Grayson was subpoenaed to testify about his involvement in the fires and the harassment campaign. Angela worked closely with the prosecution, ensuring that every piece of evidence was airtight. Lila, though exhausted, felt a sense of vindication as the truth came to light. On the day of Grayson's testimony, the courtroom was packed. Lila sat beside Angela, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. Amara and Jimmy were there too, their presence a reminder of why this fight mattered. As the evidence was presented, Grayson's facade of control began to crumble. The contractor's confession, the financial records, and the testimonies from those he had wronged painted a damning picture. By the time the court adjourned, it was clear that Grayson's reign over the town was over. That evening, as the community gathered at the newly restored church, Lila stood before them, her heart full of gratitude. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice strong. "It's ours. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we stand together in faith and love." The crowd erupted in cheers, their unity stronger than ever. Amara hugged her mother tightly, her face glowing with pride. "You were right, Mama," she said. "The truth did win." Lila smiled, tears streaming down her face. "It always does, baby. It always does." The courtroom victory marked a turning point for the town. With Mr. Grayson's grip on the community broken, the atmosphere began to shift. The news of his involvement in the fires and harassment spread quickly, and while some still clung to the past, many more embraced the possibility of a brighter future. Lila stood outside the church one crisp morning, watching as volunteers gathered to plant the first seeds in the newly restored community garden. The land, once a battleground of division, was now a symbol of hope. Amara raced ahead, her laughter filling the air as she joined Jimmy near the freshly tilled soil. "Here, plant this one," Jimmy said, handing her a small tomato plant. "It's going to grow big and strong, just like you." Amara beamed and carefully placed the plant in the ground, patting the soil around it. Nearby, families worked side by side, their conversations a harmonious blend of different voices and backgrounds. It was a scene Lila had prayed for, a tangible manifestation of the unity she had fought to create. Despite the progress, Lila knew there was one final challenge to face. Mr. Grayson, though publicly disgraced, had yet to accept responsibility for his actions. He remained silent during the trial, refusing to admit his wrongdoing. But as the investigation deepened, more evidence surfaced, and he was charged with conspiracy, arson, and harassment. One afternoon, Lila received an unexpected call from Grayson's lawyer. "Mr. Grayson would like to speak with you," the lawyer said. Privately, Lila hesitated, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what to expect, but after a moment of prayer, she agreed to meet him at the local park, the same park where Amara and Jimmy had first forged their unlikely friendship. When Lila arrived, Grayson was already there, sitting on a bench with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked older, the weight of his actions etched into his face. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Grayson looked up. "You were right," he said, his voice hoarse. "About everything. I've been so afraid of losing control, losing what I thought was mine. But all I've done is destroy." Lila felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a flicker of hope. "It's not too late to change, Mr. Grayson," she said gently. But it starts with taking responsibility. Grayson nodded slowly. I don't know if anyone will forgive me. I don't know if I can forgive myself. That's not for you to decide, Lila replied. Forgiveness isn't something we earn, it's something we're given. But you have to ask for it. From God, and from the people you've hurt. Grayson lowered his head, and for a moment, Lila thought she saw tears glistening in his eyes. I don't know how to begin, he whispered. You just did, she said. In the weeks that followed, Grayson surprised the town by issuing a public apology. He admitted his role in the fires and harassment, acknowledging the harm he had caused. I let my pride and fear blind me to what was right, he said during a press conference. To those I've hurt, I'm deeply sorry. Though not everyone accepted his apology, his words marked a turning point. Grayson sold the disputed properties and donated the proceeds to the community fund, a gesture that many saw as an attempt to make amends. The community garden flourished as spring arrived. Rows of vegetables and flowers grew under the care of the townspeople, their collective effort a testament to what they could achieve together. Amara and Jimmy became regular fixtures at the garden, their laughter and camaraderie a source of joy for everyone around them. One afternoon, as Lila watered a row of sunflowers, Pastor Thomas approached her with a smile. I don't think I've ever seen this town so alive, he said. You've done something incredible, Lila. We've done it, Lila corrected, her eyes shining with gratitude. None of this would have been possible without everyone's faith and hard work, Pastor Thomas nodded. Still, you're the one who stood firm when things were hardest. God chose you for this work, and you didn't waver. That's something to be proud of. Lila felt a wave of emotion as she looked out over the garden. It was more than just a patch of land. It was a symbol of healing, resilience, and hope. That evening, the church hosted a celebration to mark the reopening of the garden and the success of the fund. The sanctuary was filled with laughter, music, and the delicious aroma of home-cooked food. Amara and Jimmy performed a short skit they had written, drawing cheers and applause from the crowd. As the night wound down, Lila stood before the congregation, her heart full. This journey hasn't been easy, she said, her voice steady with emotion. But every challenge we faced brought us closer together. We've shown that love is stronger than hate, that faith can move mountains, and that God's light shines brightest in the darkest times. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the sanctuary. Amara ran up to her mother, throwing her arms around her waist. You did it, Mama, she said, her voice filled with pride. Lila knelt to meet her daughter's gaze. No, baby, we did it. Together, as the stars twinkled above the church that night, the town felt transformed. The divisions that once seemed insurmountable had given way to a shared sense of purpose. And while challenges would undoubtedly arise in the future, Lila knew that this victory rooted in faith, love, and perseverance had laid the foundation for lasting change. The garden, the fund, and the community itself were thriving testaments to what could be achieved when people chose unity over division, hope over despair, and love over fear. The town settled into a new rhythm in the weeks following the garden's grand reopening. The once divided community began to move forward with a sense of shared purpose. While wounds from the past didn't heal overnight, the progress was undeniable. The garden thrived, the fund expanded, and families who had never spoken to one another now worked side by side. For Lila, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though her days were still busy with meetings, planning sessions, and outreach efforts. Her work had grown beyond the town, with nearby communities reaching out for advice on creating their own initiatives. She viewed this as an answer to her prayers, proof that the ripple effects of faith and perseverance could extend far beyond what she imagined. One quiet afternoon, Lila and Amara sat in the garden together, weeding a bed of marigolds. The bright orange flowers glowed in the sunlight, a symbol of the resilience that had come to define their journey. Mama, Amara said, her hands digging into the soil, do you think everything will stay this good forever? Lila smiled, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. Life will always have its challenges, baby, she said. But now we know how strong we can be when we face them together. And no matter what happens, God's love will carry us through. Amara nodded thoughtfully, her small hands smoothing the soil around a plant. "I think I want to help people when I grow up, like you." Lila's heart swelled with pride. "You already are, Amara. Never forget how much of a difference you've made across town." Jimmy walked into his father's workshop, his steps confident in a way they hadn't been before. His father, who had been one of Grayson's early supporters, looked up from his workbench. "Hey, Dad," Jimmy said, picking up a hammer and examining it. "I was thinking, maybe we could build a bench for the garden. You know, something nice for people to sit on." His father paused, then nodded slowly. "That's a good idea, son. Let's do it." The two worked together late into the evening, their bond deepening as they sawed and sanded the wood. For Jimmy's father, the project was more than just a bench. It was a step toward healing and reconciliation, a way to support the community he had once resisted. At the church, Pastor Thomas prepared for Sunday's service, his heart full of gratitude. The pews had been fuller than ever in recent weeks, with families returning to the sanctuary and new faces joining the congregation. He glanced at the cross above the altar, its polished wood gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass window. "This is what faith can do," he murmured to himself, his voice tinged with, "Thank you, Lord, for guiding us through." Meanwhile, Mr. Grayson began his own journey of redemption. Though he had lost much his influence, his reputation, and even some of his allies, he had gained a deeper understanding of himself and his community. As part of his plea agreement, he committed to volunteering at the garden and working with the fund. At first, his presence was met with skepticism, but over time, his quiet dedication began to soften hearts. One day, as he raked leaves in the garden, Amara approached him with a watering can. "Do you want to help me water the flowers?" she asked, her voice bright and free of judgment. Grayson hesitated, then nodded. Together, they moved from row to row, their small moment of collaboration symbolizing the possibility of change. As the seasons changed, so did the town. The garden became a gathering place for celebrations, prayer meetings, and quiet moments of reflection. The community fund expanded to include scholarships for local students, providing opportunities for a brighter future. Lila's leadership remained central to these efforts, but she made sure to uplift others, ensuring that the movement would continue to grow even if she stepped away. One evening, during a special service at the church, Pastor Thomas invited Lila to the pulpit. The congregation stood, applauding as she approached. "We wouldn't be here without you, Lila," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your faith and determination have been a blessing to all of us." Lila looked out at the crowd, her eyes glistening with tears. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about all of us and about the God who brought us together. When we started this journey, I didn't know how hard it would be, but I also didn't know how strong we could become. Thank you for walking this path with me." As the service ended, Amara ran to her mother and hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Mama," she said. Lila knelt to meet her daughter's gaze. "I'm proud of you too, Amara. You've been my strength through all of this." Together, they walked out into the cool evening air, the stars twinkling above them. The garden lay ahead, its rows of plants bathed in moonlight. For Lila, it was a reminder of all they had overcome and all they could achieve together. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. Their town, once divided, was now a testament to the power of faith, love, and perseverance. And though there would always be more work to do, Lila knew they were ready to face it together. Call to action. As this story reminds us, unity and faith can overcome even the darkest challenges. If you were inspired by this journey, consider sharing it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and hope, and don't forget to watch the next video. Together, we can continue spreading light in a world that needs it. Thank you for being part of this community.